Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us and braving DC traffic to be with us. We really appreciate it. This is our first public event for our new Resilience Center here at the Atlantic Council. We're delighted you all could be here. We're looking forward to a great discussion today on how communities, states, and national governments, both here in the United States but also internationally, can build more resilient approaches to handling unexpected migration flows. Before I give just a quick overview of the report, I wanted to say a few words about our new center more broadly and what we hope to do going forward. Anyone who reads the news or watches television knows that the pace of change right now in our world is really unprecedented and shows no sign of slowing. Disruptions are accelerating, and though they can have positive and negative consequences, we know they're going to just keep coming at us. And at this point, neither prevention strategies or response strategies alone are enough anymore in the face of these kinds of complex challenges, particularly given the very interconnected nature of the world that we're in today. So we at the Atlantic Council believe that part of the answer to the challenges we're facing is to build our capacity for resilience across multiple sectors, multiple disciplines, and at multiple levels, starting at the individual level, but also at the community level, at the government level, and really even as much as at the international institutional level. Put simply, resilience is the ability to deal with change, often negative change, and to continue to develop and thrive even in the face of that change. And we want to really sort of bring a lot of focus to that as a technique to try to respond to the challenges that we're seeing in the world. Our goal in the new center is going to be to identify and promote resilient solutions to pressing problems, like unanticipated migration flows, on a local, national, and international scale. We really want to focus on developing pragmatic policy ideas, policy-relevant ideas, and working with other partners who share our interests to try to put these ideas into effect in the real world. So many of the organizations that you all represent, we think, can be great partners for us. Our first report is looking at irregular migration, and that's going to be a starting point for us at the center, but we also want to look at other different kinds of challenges, and we're looking forward to getting started. I have to say, it was very much a visionary businesswoman and lawyer who first approached us at the Atlantic Council with the idea for a resilience center. And I'd very much like to thank Adrienne Arsht, our very generous supporter, for both supporting the new center, but also supporting the Atlantic Council more broadly. We couldn't do it without you, and we very much appreciate your support, so thank you. Let me quickly just turn to the report because I know we've just handed it out today, and I just want to give a quick overview before I introduce our panelists. As you all know, irregular migration, particularly when it involves the kinds of large numbers of migrants that we've seen in the last few years, can be highly disruptive, particularly at the local level. We've seen negative reactions to immigration in the last few years and how they influenced British voters on Brexit, for example, and in many other countries in the European Union that's sort of roiling the politics of these countries. It was a factor in our own election last year. It was certainly a factor in the rise of nationalist candidates like Marine Le Pen in France, and it will probably be an issue for Germany as they face their election this fall. And in fact, German Foreign Minister Wolfgang Schäuble has called the recent major waves of migration our rendezvous with globalization, which I think is a very sort of apt phrase that really sums it up. We thought, recognizing that we may never, as an international community, be able to fully resolve the causes of migration, we wanted to dig into how communities and governments can build more resilience into their immigration policies and into their programs for handling migrants once they arrive in new communities. We chose to look not just at traditional refugees, meaning people who are perhaps fleeing localities because of natural disasters or because of armed conflicts. We also wanted to look at people who may feel forced to leave their homes because of a lack of economic opportunity or just widespread violence, like what we saw in Central America, for example, in the last couple of years. Our recommendations fall into three broad categories. I would say first, the importance of having parity in programs at the local level. Second, having stronger communication and coordination mechanisms between different levels of government and between different stakeholders involved in supporting migrant populations. And three, and very importantly, finding funding to support these kinds of programs in advance, not waiting until the moment of crisis to try to figure out how to pay for these programs. We've looked at programs that have worked very well here in the United States, but also in places like Canada and Germany. And a common theme is really that working closely with stakeholders, particularly civil society groups and community organizations like churches and businesses, they are able to work together. What is most successful is working together to create programs that benefit all residents in a community, native-born populations in the host communities, as well as migrants who are coming in. And when you work together and make those programs available to everyone, it seems to do a lot to decrease the potential for resentment between native-born populations and those who are newer to the community. We also conclude that countries and regional organizations like the European Union really need to create funding mechanisms and identify funds for these kinds of programs in advance. Leaders need to have the time and space to create these kinds of mechanisms and programs. And if countries and state governments wait until the waves of migration are already upon them, it's too late, and it makes the situation much more difficult. So several of our recommendations point to trying to think more creatively about how to identify funds and funding mechanisms in advance. So with that, I'd like to call up our panelists and introduce them. Ladies, if you'd come up to the stage, that would be terrific. I'm delighted to have joining us first, on the left, Amy Pope, who is the author of our report and a non-resident senior fellow at the Council. Unfortunately for us, Amy is going to be moving actually to the United Kingdom soon, but we're just delighted to have her with us this morning. Amy most recently served as Deputy Homeland Security Advisor in the Obama administration. And among many difficult challenges that Amy worked on, she personally coordinated our efforts to combat the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa, the Zika sort of challenges that we've had that have now started to come into the United States. But also, she was really on point for President Obama in addressing the challenges that were posed by the major migration flows we saw coming over the southern border because of all of the challenges in Central America. So Amy really has tremendous and direct personal experience at the national government level, and look forward to talking with you about that in more detail. I'm also pleased to introduce Rachel Perrick, who is Deputy Director of Welcoming America, who is a partner NGO with us in this event, and is a leading group doing terrific work to develop more resilient approaches to immigration to try to create more prosperous communities. Rachel is very well known in the NGO community and has had a long career working on community building issues at the local and international level. So thank you both very much for being with us. And with that, I will get the discussion started. Okay, Amy, to start with, you have laid out a range of recommendations ranging from the local level and what communities can do all the way up to the national level and even multilateral organizations. Based on your own experience in government, particularly dealing with the challenges of the unaccompanied children situation, what do you see as the biggest obstacle to putting into motion and getting implemented some of the recommendations that you've put forward? How can we try to work in very practical ways to make some of these recommendations a reality?
So first, let me thank all of you for being here today. This is an important conversation to have, particularly right now, when we're still sort of being buffeted by various points of view on immigration. And I know this is a tough conversation to have, but I think it's important for us to come to it with evidence and the experience of the communities who've dealt with it. So I'm excited to be here. Second, I have to thank Adrienne Arsht, who had the vision for this center and has been a real champion. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have written this paper and be part of this conversation. Just a quick, a little bit of information about myself so that you can use that as you think through kind of what I'm putting on the table. As Christine said, I was President Obama's Deputy Homeland Security Advisor. And basically my job was to prepare for and then respond to basically anything that happened here in the United States. And that ranged from Zika and Ebola to migrants and foreign fighters and just terrorist events, et cetera. So it was just all over the place. But I oversaw three parts of the National Security Council in particular: our resilience directorate, our response directorate, and our transborder directorate. And so doing this project allowed for me to draw from those three different directorates to learn from my experiences kind of across a spectrum in a way that I hadn't always been able to do before. And so it was really a tremendous exercise for me to do this and to think about migration in terms of resilience. And I think that's actually, it turned out to be a very useful frame. So when I think about the challenges, I will admit that my bias is coming from the government. I worked for a long time in the federal government, and so I see those challenges first and foremost, and I recognize that they're not the only ones. But I think one of the challenges that we have is political will. I mean, what we see right now with the federal government not necessarily aligned with the state governments and the local governments, I think is our biggest challenge. That doesn't mean, and I'm speaking specifically about the United States, but certainly we're seeing that elsewhere. The best response is one where you can get the multiple governments lined up and find points of commonality. When the federal government is not looking to engage and not leading, then we need to figure out who can lead. What we've seen is that at the local level, we have mayors who are stepping up, we have governors stepping up, we have other leaders within government who are willing to try these creative solutions. And so I think to overcome the challenge of the federal government or the lack of political will at some levels, the response is then to look to empower the state and local governments, and for the community groups that are working around those governments to really look to build the coalitions at that level. So I think that's the first primary challenge. And the second one really goes down to funding and planning. As I said in my prior job, I was doing a lot of response to natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, you name it, hurricanes. And the primary playbook there was we can generally anticipate the pieces that will need to come together in a response, and we can generally anticipate that there will be a need for funding. And so we've created an entire playbook and funding mechanism to respond to those challenges. I think we need to apply the same frame to what we've been doing in immigration. And that's challenging from a political will point of view, and it's challenging from a bureaucratic point of view. But I think the lessons learned from both actually parallel quite a bit. And so the challenge is really just reorienting one's thinking. But there's a great model that exists in the United States already that we can use to build a different response mechanism to migration waves here in the United States and around the world.
Terrific, thank you. Well, I think consistent with your point about much of the action and much of the potential is at sort of the state and local level. Rachel, I wanted to ask you, with all of your experience in the Welcoming America organization, what do you think has been sort of your biggest success story? And and maybe have there been efforts that you all have undertaken that haven't been as successful? What have been some of the lessons learned that have come out of that?
Sure. Let me also first begin just by saying thank you to Adrienne Arsht and to the Atlantic Council for hosting this event, for all of you being here today. I'm so thrilled to have this connection being made between the idea of resilience and migration. It's not one that we often make, but I think is crucially important, and I want to share the story of how Welcoming America came to be to, I think, illustrate where some of those connections can be. So that story takes us back to Tennessee about a decade ago, where we learned, frankly, through some failures. So I'll say a little bit about that. So Tennessee, about 10 years ago, was experiencing a pretty rapid demographic change. And what was unique about that was that it was happening in a place that didn't have a lot of history of immigration, which was true of a lot of places in the U.S. So we had a big wave of immigration, the biggest in the last century. It was highly dispersed. People went still to some of the big centers that we know of, New York, Chicago, et cetera, but they also went to places like Tennessee, like Arkansas, places that didn't have a recent history of immigration, and that created a lot of anxiety in communities. And in Tennessee, when people first started arriving, there was sort of this initial, let's say, a honeymoon of welcoming, where people, began to meet their new neighbors. They began to provide services like English classes and job training, things that are really important to help people get on their feet. But as the population grew and grew, people started to ask questions. People who had lived in Tennessee all their lives and weren't sure what to make of all of this change. And unfortunately, groups like the one that our executive director had started there, the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, were doing a lot of work to support immigrants, but weren't doing a lot of work to really explain to the broader community why this change was happening. And so, of course, the worst fears and prejudices can evolve from that. And what they realized was that they needed to launch an effort that would really build that bridge, really help to manage the change, the demographic change that was happening, really reach out to the broader community through communications, through creating opportunities to meet one another, because when a community changes and you have new people, that so often doesn't happen. So they did that work through the Welcoming Tennessee initiative in the city of Nashville and also in a smaller town called Shelbyville, Tennessee. It began to change the climate. Things began to improve. In about 2006, Nashville, Tennessee was being called a sort of epicenter of anti-immigrant sentiment. That shifted. There was a sort of test of the community with some efforts to pass an English-only law that got resoundingly defeated by the public. Groups began to put in place structures, policies that would help immigrants be able to really participate fully in the community. The mayor ultimately, under the leadership of Mayor Carl Dean, opened an Office of New Americans, which still stands there today. And in 2014, President Obama visited Nashville and talked about it as being potentially one of the most welcoming cities in the country. So there was this big shift that happened over time. And the lesson there was that to become a community that is really welcoming for newcomers, you have to be a community that's welcoming for the people that have lived there all their lives too. There has to be this intentional effort to really reach out and build a bridge to longtime residents. So that was lesson one. Lesson two was that in the course of becoming a more welcoming city, Nashville also became one of the fastest growing economies in our country, and by 2012 was actually leading the country in job growth. And of course, immigration didn't cause that. It was one of many factors. But if you go and talk to business leaders there and civic leaders there, they'll tell you that it was instrumental in Nashville becoming a successful city economically. There was some research done by the Nashville Chamber of Commerce that asked business leaders about how they felt about the changes that had happened and what was important to creating a thriving economy. And they identified that being a welcoming community for immigrants was really key to that. So Nashville, I think, is a great example of a place that was able to demonstrate that we can be more resilient to ethnopopulism. We can be more resilient to demographic change when we approach it in new ways that bring the community along. And secondly, when we do that, it creates benefits not just for newcomers to the city, but also to the community as a whole economically.
Can I ask both of you, your different perspectives, how can we do a better job? It does feel like, and I think, this is something that we try to draw out in the report, that there are communities all around the country that are experiencing major demographic change, where you have aging populations, you have some cities and towns that are sort of hollowing out, where you have population flight, where new immigrants can potentially be a source for the workforce. And then you also have migrants who are coming in who are looking for economic opportunity. What are each of your thoughts on how we can do a better job of sort of that matchmaking process? Because it does, certainly my sense of the way we handle it internally in the United States right now is we don't always do that in a very intentional way. And it feels like it's a missed opportunity right now that could become a very positive thing.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I was there in the 80s as the steel mills were closing down. When I went off to college in the early 90s, there was a big billboard outside of Pittsburgh that said something like, "Well, the last person to leave Pittsburgh, please turn off the lights." Right? This is sort of a quintessential example of a community that was really kind of pummeled by the changes that were brought on by globalization. The steel industry pretty much collapsed. Jobs that people had were gone. The skills that people had were gone. And the city, if you look at it today, has really revitalized. And so that was part of that was one little factor as I started to look at this, that caused me to go deeper and figure out what was going on. And what I found was incredible evidence that economists have done over the years demonstrating how in communities like Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, Nashville, other sort of the Rust Belt cities, it's the immigration, and this is not just in recent years, but dating back to the 70s, immigration has helped to replace a declining population, bring in skills, build the kind of Main Street businesses that communities need so that people want to walk the streets and go out in the neighborhoods. And that was striking because it felt to me like that story was lost over and over again. People saw immigration in one silo and they saw economic revitalization, urban revitalization in another. And that really led me to the conclusion that we need to do a better job, one, of communicating the good success that we're seeing around the country and around the world, frankly, but also to intentionally pull together these communities. I know from my work in the federal government, traditionally, when we're dealing with an immigration problem, I have the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, and occasionally there'll be another couple of departments that were sort of HHS, Health and Human Services, because they did the financing of refugees. We'll have those folks in a room trying to figure out the solution. But we weren't thinking about where the economic agencies were, where the President's Council or economic advisors were, people who could tell us, look, there are these communities around the United States that would really benefit from new labor or new skills, or they have a declining population, et cetera. And I think that's an important way to think about this problem set. We need to stop looking at immigration as a problem just for immigration advocates and people who are doing resettling. We need to pull together these different streams so that we're thinking about it as a way to build economic revitalization in a community. And I think that's kind of the number one takeaway from my point of view and just looking at these different examples. The communities that are doing very well, like Nashville, they have overcome that. They have brought the business leaders into the room. They have brought the resettlement folks into the room. They've brought the advocates into the room. So they're all coming up with a solution. And I think you'll have the most success when you're able to do that.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting threads around resilience is the idea of forethought and planning. And I think we have done a poor job in this country of really planning for demographic change, planning at a community level for when we have these changes in population. And I think particularly for cities that are losing population, this becomes even more important. So let me give the case of Dayton, Ohio. In 2011, Dayton leaders brought the community together to create what became the Welcome Dayton Plan, which is an initiative that's still going strong. And they really put this question to the community: what would it take for the city of Dayton to be a truly welcoming place for everyone? And they identified a series of different recommendations that span from making it possible for kids in school to get access to English language learning opportunities, but also to better connect with their native-born peers, making it possible for businesses to open up on Main Street. We know that most of the growth in Main Street businesses in this country has come from immigrants, making it easier for immigrants to buy homes in Dayton and everybody to buy homes in Dayton. Since 2011, Dayton had been on a path of about 50 years of population decline. They've finally been able to turn that around, and that's a huge success story for that city, and I think one that a lot of other cities can really look toward. Whether they realize it or not, all cities are competing for population, and particularly in a global economy, they're competing to have the talent and the diversity that they need to really be competitive and be effective. So putting in place strategies that really make it possible for people to come, to put down roots, to be really invested in a community, whether that's civically or socially or economically, will make them more successful places.
I think, right now, and Amy, you alluded to this sort of in your opening comments, this is a challenging time right now to be dealing with this issue. And the political climate here, I think, in the United States is certainly challenging. And we appear to be on a trajectory towards reducing government assistance for a lot of these programs, potentially. I mean, you have, potentially significant budget cuts to state and other parts of the domestic programs. Given that political climate and that context, What do you think are the most effective ways to try to advocate to the public and to leaders at various levels of government the need for a more resilient approach? I mean, are there ways, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, are there ways that mayors, that NGOs, civil society organizations can try to compensate for what may be some reductions to the federal programs that would undergird some of these more resilient approaches?
Yeah, I think we have not sufficiently tapped the private sector. What struck me after President Trump issued his executive order was that there was an amicus brief and statements by a wide range of private sector actors who were going to be negatively impacted by the executive order, barring migration from nationals from certain countries and decreasing the numbers of refugees. And certainly on the one hand, that was motivated by a sense of social responsibility. But on the other hand, there's a real business case that we have seen, and throughout this report, I heard firsthand from businesses that benefit from the skills brought by these new and changing groups of people. And so I think the private sector has a very important place in the solution. One is that they are very important advocates, particularly when we're dealing with the current administration. I think the private sector can be some of the most effective advocates for why immigration is necessary to a robust economy here in the United States. Two, the private sector actually has the capacity to build some of this infrastructure, to provide resources, job training, jobs, et cetera, and there's will there to do so. And I think really figuring out how to better expand the connections between the private sector and the advocacy community and the immigrant communities and the cities is really at the heart of the solution, especially when you have a federal government that is less inclined to come up with the solutions themselves. We saw that even President Obama last year co-hosted with a number of other countries around the world a refugee summit. And a very, very important piece of that summit was to get the commitment of hundreds of different private sector actors to help bring a solution to what was happening with the refugee crisis. And I think we should be looking to the private sector because they have so much to gain from a functioning immigration system. They have so much to gain from the skills that these immigrants bring to the market. And ultimately, a system that's working well is of benefit to them as much as to any community here or in the world.
That's exactly right. And I think as you all know from our the invitation we put out, we had originally had Caroline Atkinson, who's the head of public policy for Google, who was supposed to be with us this morning. Unfortunately, she was called back to the UK for a family emergency. But one of the reasons we wanted to have Caroline is because we do think the private sector plays a critical role in this. Mm-hmm. And, companies like Google, but also UPS, Walmart, many of the sort of major big box companies are, I think, already very engaged in this issue, but, we could certainly do more. And I wondered, Rachel, whether you had experiences from Welcoming America's perspective of, any particular success stories working with the private sector or any thoughts on how we could do more to try to engage them in this issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Welcoming America is working with communities all over the country who are coming together in a multi-sector way to create these local initiatives. And corporations and smaller businesses have very much been at the table in those conversations, whether we're talking about Pittsburgh or Anchorage, Alaska, or Atlanta, Georgia. My colleague Monica Fuentes, who's here with us today, worked with the mayor of Atlanta when he was getting his initiative off the ground. The Coca-Cola Company, which is headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia Power, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest employer in the state of Georgia, was at the table as part of those conversations because it was important to them that their employees feel valued in the community, that when they walk down the street, they don't get dirty looks, that when their kids go to school, they're not being bullied, and because they're trying to attract people from all over the world to come work there. And Atlanta, from the mayor's perspective, has both this long history as being the city that was too busy to hate, which meant that during the civil rights movement, what helped move the city forward was the fact that it was able to keep a focus on being an inclusive city, both from a moral perspective and for business reasons, for smart business reasons. And that's still true today around this issue of immigration. If the city is going to move forward, if it's going to continue to be an international hub for business, it needs to be globally oriented, and being an inclusive place is a part of that, and it's what brought businesses to the table there, and I think in a number of other cities across the country.
It feels like cities and mayors are really sort of a key linchpin for this. Yes. And, you know, I'd really like to sort of dig into ways that we can try to engage mayors more comprehensively. And I know, Amy, one of the recommendations that you have in the report was, as you noted, kind of coming out of the experience with the huge migration waves coming out of Syria and Iraq in the last couple of years. The UN actually did come forward and create the Global Compact on Migration, but they need to build out on that. And one of the recommendations you made or suggestions you made was that maybe part of that needs to be, and it's not necessarily what you think of with the UN and nation states, but reaching out to mayors around the world. And I wondered if you could just elaborate on that. And also, you know, something we'd like to do at the Atlantic Council and at the Resilience Center is to think about how do we take the good ideas in a report like this and really try to start building support to get them implemented. And we need creative ideas about how best to do that. I know one, you didn't mention it in your sort of short comments about the work you did at the Obama administration, but you were very engaged in the Arctic Council, for example. Right. And I wonder, do we need a model like that or some sort of a task force among key countries to work on some of these ideas and to maybe work with mayors?
Yeah, I like that a lot. I was very, very pleased that Mayor Garcetti from Los Angeles wrote the foreword to the report. To me, Los Angeles in particular really captures the value of migration and some of the challenges that migration poses within a community, but also what are very tangible benefits ultimately to a community when you have a wide range of migration and watching those communities become part of the fabric of a city. So that was really important to me, and I'm very thankful to the mayor for being part of this project. But what I did see over and over again, and this was sort of a theme throughout writing this report, is that migration is happening on a global level, and it's often happening in sort of far-flung reaches of the globe, places where if I'm from Iowa, I'm not really following what's happening in Sudan or what's happening in Syria. But the impact of migration is very local. It is who's my neighbor and who's going to my school and who's showing up in my emergency rooms and who, it's sort of this very almost intimate experience that one has. And so I think the challenge for all of us and for governments in particular is how do you take the global and bring it down to the local? Because what I've seen is that the greatest tensions is when there's a real disconnect between those communities. Mm-hmm. So one of the solutions, and this isn't mine, this is put forward by, for example, there's a group of European mayors that have come together and issued a series of recommendations, is to involve the mayors as governments are trying to figure out what to do. So in a situation in the European Union, for example, when they had wave after wave of migrants, not just from Syria, but from Afghanistan, from North Africa, coming into their country, the answer is not just to have a bunch of European Union ministers trying to figure out a solution in Brussels. The answer is to engage the people who are on the ground in the communities throughout Europe, in the cities throughout Europe, and figure out what their capacity is, figure out what resources they have or they don't have, figure out what their funding challenges are going to be, figure out what funding resources are available to them, and then try to come up with a solution that takes into account what is actually happening on the ground as opposed to a solution that is more theoretical and that should work, ideally, but once it gets rolled out to the different communities, it falls apart because there's no buy-in or there's no resources or et cetera. So I think that that is an unusual way of thinking about the problem. How do we go from global to local? But there are some examples, and most importantly, there are mayors who are anxious to be part of this conversation. They see it more than we see it here in Washington. They feel it in ways that are very concrete and that will have a very direct impact on who's elected and who's staying in the city, et cetera. And so bringing them in very early, soliciting their input, having them be part of developing the solutions, I think that's really, really key.
Rachel, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that. Or...
Yeah, I think you're right, Amy. And what we've seen is that at the local level, leaders are eminently pragmatic. This is immediate to them, and they want to respond. And in fact, the research bears this out. So there's been some research looking at how local officials are responding to immigrants. And you would think if you pick up the paper and read the news that it's not always the most welcoming response. But actually, the research shows, not just in big cities, but actually in smaller towns as well, that for the most part, local officials, mayors, city managers, police chiefs, are by far more accommodating than they are restrictive in terms of their immigration policies, and it's for that very reason. And I think that presents a huge opportunity, both to connect folks that are doing the work on the ground and support them to do it better and more effectively, and that's something that NGOs can support. But it creates a huge need, I think, for a federal response too. In the previous administration, the White House Task Force on New Americans was an effort to try to begin that process of looking at how the federal government could play a role, not just around immigration and who comes in, but immigrant integration, what actually happens in communities once people arrive, and how to make sure that they're really fully part of the community. And that starts with listening, I think, to local officials and what their needs are.
Thank you. Well, why don't we give people from the audience a chance to ask questions? I know many of you represent organizations that work in this space, and we'd like to both give you the opportunity to talk with our panelists, but also to hear your ideas about what has been successful in terms of trying to integrate new populations, whether it's here in the United States or in other countries around the world. So I think if there are people who'd like to ask questions, we have microphones going around, and I would just ask that you say your name, and if you're affiliated with the group, to just let us know what that is. Anyone with questions? Don't be shy. Yes, the lady in the green scarf.
Hi, I'm Mona Yakubian. I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace, but in my most previous incarnation, I was at USAID working on Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq. And I'm struck by how similar the conclusions are that you all have reached with respect to domestic issues and resettlement, whether it's focusing on the local level, the need to ensure host communities are also, their needs are also addressed, the value of bringing in the private sector. There's some interesting innovations that have been engineered in Lebanon, in Jordan. Lebanon has the highest number of refugees per capita in the world. I'm curious the extent to which you all have thought about more information sharing, both from domestic U.S. and solutions that are working in the U.S. to help out communities or people working on these issues in Jordan and Lebanon, and vice versa, learning from Jordan, Lebanon, and other countries that are contending with large refugee populations. So to what extent can you envision sort of a broader international information sharing?
So that's a great question. And the first piece of it, the report doesn't specifically deal with the communities that are the first sort of point of entry for migrants, partly because I think those challenges in some cases are more immediate and they're a little bit different. But you're right that there's a lot of commonality here. And I think that there's tremendous room for information sharing. And again, it's not just immigration expert to immigration expert. It really needs to look at what's happening economically. We were talking before the panel about education, opportunities for education. And I think communities, when they're just hit with a wave of any disruptive force, but certainly immigration, they react. They're reacting sort of in a very short-term way. They're not thinking about what's the long-term impact on my community. But we all know that with many of these migration flows, we're not talking about a year even, or 2 years. Sometimes we're talking 10, 20, 30 years. We're talking about communities that are having children and raising them, and they become part of that host country. And so figuring out how we learn from these experiences and import what tend to be sort of, okay, we have a little bit of distance, and how do we plan for it, using those same lessons for the communities that are the immediate host country. I think that's really important. I think the funding question is extraordinarily important. What we've seen in terms of places like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey is that their infrastructures have been overwhelmed. They didn't have the capacity. And the rest of the world wasn't that well positioned to help them build that capacity. This is not part of the report, but I think it'd be an interesting area for exploration, is to think about where in the world we anticipate big migration flows, and then to think about how can we structure aid and assistance in the neighboring countries now, before the migration flows happen, so that those neighboring countries are not completely destabilized at the time they see the migration. And I think that's a sort of a different way of thinking about the problem, but I think that would be much more forward-leaning and allow for a much more resilient response when it happens.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, see you in the polka dots.
Hi, my name is Wendy Chan, and I was really pleased to hear the panelists talked about the importance of grassroots support. And in my volunteering capacity, I actually co-founded a network called Northern Virginia Friends of Refugees. What we found is that in a short amount of time, we really started the network about 8 months, 10 months ago. We already have over 500 members in the network, representing over 100 NGOs, faith communities, and local business and government agencies working together to help every refugee feel welcome and to help every resident to become a welcoming friend. That's our mission. So my question is, in my capacity of kind of organizing this on a volunteering basis, a gap that I'm seeing is there's a lack of opportunity to create that dialogue between the two aisles, right? Mm-hmm. Like, basically, how do we reach to the other side of the people who are not supporting, who are not welcoming? Have you seen any successful examples where activities, where events, perhaps, where kind of model that's working in terms of bringing people from different sides of issue to come together and have that dialogue? As we see, this is quite important. You know, it's reflected in our election results.
Thank you. Rachel, I don't know if you probably have some experience with that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you and thank you for the work that you're doing. And I think that the refugee resettlement sector has been really, I think, leading on some of the really innovative work happening in communities now to try to build that bridge. I see my colleague Jen Smyers back there, and just now is such an important time because people are coming out of the out of the public to want to support this issue and looking for ways to do that. And I think one of the best things they can do is try to really reach people who are unsure about this issue and try to create a bridge there. So there's basically 3 things that we found across communities can be successful in doing that. The first one is about engaging leaders. So finding leaders from either the host community or from the refugee community itself that can really be advocates, not just around policy, but really around this idea of trying to reach out to people who maybe we're not doing such a good job of reaching. The second is strategic communication, so really trying to communicate the shared values between people of different backgrounds in the community, try to highlight the positive examples of success there. And the last thing is contact. We know from a lot of research that intergroup contact, when facilitated in a smart way, can really break down some of the barriers between people. And the good news is that there are literally infinite ways that you can create opportunities for people to come together and develop relationships and trust with one another. I think the key is to do that in places that feel safe for people, whether that's in a faith setting, whether that's in a community garden where people can bring their skills and apply it to a project that benefits the community but that everybody can contribute to, whether that's over a meal. I think we've seen lots of examples now of people coming together over these dinners or suppers. But working on a project together, breaking bread together, coming together in a place that feels safe for all people are some of the ways that you can get started. And we have a number of guides on our website, and I'm happy to talk afterward to share some examples with you.
Terrific.
I have to share my personal experience here because my father is And I use him all the time, so sorry, Dad. My dad was not necessarily a person who was open to immigration, very skeptical about the refugee admissions, resettlement policies that the last administration was advocating. And he and my mother came down to join us for Thanksgiving, and I told him that we had met some refugees at a refugee Thanksgiving. They were going to be joining us for dinner, and my father made all sorts of inappropriate comments about what that might look like. By the end of the dinner, my father, just having a conversation with someone who had fled, understanding the circumstances of why they left, understanding the struggles they'd had once they'd come to the U.S. and tried to find their way, understanding that they still had family that were all around the globe, many of whom were still in danger. It just fundamentally changed his perspective on what we were doing and the subject of refugees. And in a way that I have had thousands of arguments with my dad over the years, since the age of maybe 10, and have never, ever been able to convince him of one thing. But that experience of engaging with someone face to face and making what was kind of political actually real was the most impactful, most effective tool that I didn't actually foresee that it would come out that way. But it was the most effective and impactful tool that worked. And I think that's what the Welcoming America experience has shown time and again. It's people engaging with people and finding those points where they're connecting and recognizing the points of commonality versus when you can sort of think about somebody as a group that's different and your defenses go up. And that's where it's very difficult to create solutions.
Yeah, thank you.
It was planned, that Thanksgiving dinner invitation, I take it. It wasn't just a coincidence that they were there.
Right.
Great story. Okay, I think I saw, yes, in the stripes right here, and then we'll get you in the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Andrea Gillespie, and I'm currently a graduate intern at Human Rights First, and I go to the University of Michigan Ford School of Public Policy. Go Blue. So I have a question for you regarding children and children of immigrants. We often talk about job training and adults, but how do you think that we can better involve children in recommendations for building successful, resilient communities, whether that's targeting money for education, ESL, or anti-bullying measures within schools and health, especially for refugee children who have experienced trauma?
Well, I think you just did a good job of naming some of the really important structural and policy things that we can do to make schools a better place for children when they land. And we were just having this conversation earlier that schools are really the epicenter for immigrant integration. I mean, they're the first place where a child goes and either feels or doesn't feel a sense of community, where a parent goes and either does or doesn't feel a sense of community. And because our school system in the U.S. is so locally driven and diffuse, I think it just reinforces, again, the need to start local and really equip schools with the ideas, with the capacity to try to build a sense of belonging into everything that they're doing, in addition to clearly needing to fund, teacher training around DSL, more services around English language learning. We want people to become Americans, but we don't always give them the tools to be able to do that quickly, and we need to invest in those things.
I think the woman in the back had a question.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Alyssa Miller. I work here at the Atlantic Council in the Rafiq Hariri Center. I have a question about Europe and the Middle East. So regarding migrant flows basically through Africa, up through Libya into Europe, most of the time this is viewed in a solely counter-terror lens, at least from the perspective of Southern European countries that are addressing this threat. So how do you shift that mentality, solely focusing on security issues, to more responsibly addressing both counter-terror interests and
ways to settle people more uniformly? When there's a lot of chaos, that actually increases that destabilizes and increases the likelihood of security issues or security risks. So that the more communities can be forward-leaning and intentional and anticipate how they're going to respond when they see waves of migration, I actually believe creates a better national security response ultimately. at the moment, I'm looking a lot at this very question, national security and immigration, and sort of teasing out what are the real national security issues versus sort of regular migration. And there's been a lot of talk, for example, about the refugee program being used as a way to bring in terrorists. If you look at the refugee program, I know this firsthand, but I also know it from the work I'm doing now. The refugee program is the most vetted program we have in the United States. They're evaluating people based on iris scans, on fingerprints, on intelligence, on information from foreign partners. It takes years to resettle someone, 18 months to 2 years to resettle someone who comes into the refugee program. If you're a bad guy, the refugee program is the worst way to come into the United States to do harm. And it's just, it's not really sensical that that's the way that you're going to go. If you have terrorist intent. So I think the better way to think about it is, okay, how do we do need to share information between governments, improve our networks with governments, but also let's be sensible about what's happening and think about what programs we can put in place to deal with the vast majority of migrants who are coming in who pose no risk to a community. And the failure to plan is actually the real risk.
Thanks, Amy. I think the gentleman here, and then we'll have a last question over here.
Thank you. I think that last point is really topical. Gail in England, currently at the One campaign. Previously, I was with USRAP, with U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. I'm curious on the role of on one side, fragile states as states are the primary drivers that push people to flee their homes. But on the integration side, a lot of what you've spoken of is resettlement and integration in major urban areas. But when we look at polling data, both in the US and Europe, a lot of the most vitriolic and anti-immigrant spaces are in rural communities. And as someone who grew up in rural Arizona and rural Alaska, I'm interested in what do you think are the most effective ways to engage outside of the more prosperous urban areas to come up against some of the most problematic rhetoric and feelings in rural areas? And what are the tactics you think are effective in those spaces? Thank you.
Do you want to start?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you asked that question. And it's true, we need to be reaching the communities that are struggling the most with seeing new people, and that is rural communities and smaller towns and suburbs. And in fact, I talked in the story about Tennessee a lot about Nashville. What I didn't talk about was the smaller town of Shelbyville. And there's a great film that aired on PBS in 2011 called Welcome to Shelbyville, which actually shows what the work that happened in this smaller town really looks like. And it's a lot of the same things that we're talking about here, community-led, people from the community coming together to build this trust between people. And I think that's so important in communities where being neighborly is something that's even more important, where we want to weave people together. There are tons of great examples from places like small town Nebraska and rural communities there of this bridge building work. And one example that I especially love comes from a couple of small towns in Nebraska, working with the Nebraska's Home Initiative that looked at the business community and realized that there were new businesses being opened by Latino residents that the US-born white residents had never been to, and vice versa. So they got together with the Chamber of Commerce and some of the business owners and just simply took people on a tour of those businesses and brought them into each other's stores. And I think just like your father's conversation, it opened up a new way of seeing people who had been present as neighbors but hadn't really been neighbors in the truest sense of the word. And I think we need to take it down to sort of that basic level of just beginning to build what I think is really community resilience, weaving together these different threads into a fabric of community that is stronger than those individual threads are individually. And that starts in places that I think, even more than our big cities, know what that really means, and that's small towns and rural communities.
I was struck by the number of examples I found of rural and small town communities that were struggling with immigration, that embraced immigration, that benefited from immigration. A couple of highlights. We actually had the mayor's wife from Anchorage write a piece here for this report, because Alaska is really struggling with a host of challenges because of its location, because of climate change, because of population, et cetera. And there they've really embraced this idea of how do we build immigrants into the solution for our communities, as opposed to immigration being the problem that we're trying to fix. Immigration is part of the solution. We also saw there's been some really fascinating stories that have been captured. One about a small town in Germany, a couple of less than 10,000 people who really benefited from the new migrants who came to their communities. But key to that was the buy-in, the local government bringing people together, building the relationships, the private sector providing an opening for folks, if it's Main Street or if it's the farming community. We've heard from the American Farm Bureau. They've actually been quite important advocates in the U.S. immigration debate for immigration reform because so many agricultural workers are not U.S. born. And so farmers, and we've heard this as part of my research, but certainly the work I've done before, the farming community is desperate for the work that's brought by migrant communities. And so I really want to be part of the solution. So identifying, especially again, it goes back to who makes up the community, really leaning on the private sector because the private sector is often benefiting, whether it's farming, whether it's small town businesses, whether it's big businesses that are setting up factories or shops or whatever around the country, and using those folks to drive forward the change.
Thank you. Why don't we have the last question here?
Hi, I'm Nadia Ferozian from the Democracy Fund and formerly was at DHS. Just sort of thinking through this, the other side to some of the refugee crisis that we've seen in this country has been the development of family detention, where unaccompanied mothers where asylum-seeking women and children are being housed in family detention centers in various parts of the country. I guess I'm wondering, we've got sort of the notion of resilient communities and understanding the role that immigration plays in that. The alternative is that we have securitized immigration considerably, and we have criminalized people who are crossing the border considerably. How is it that we blend sort of blend this thinking to find genuine alternatives to family detention, where there are significant health issues, where there are problems with schooling with some of these kids, there are language access issues, there are a variety of things that are going on there. And so while there is resiliency being built on one end, there is security there is sort of highly securitized security being built on the other. And I'm wondering what it is that we need to be doing about that.
So just to give a little bit of perspective on that, the number of the family detention is a teeny, tiny, tiny piece of a much bigger issue. So not to, I'm sort of trying to take on the problem as what is happening very, very broadly. But I think the real key to addressing the issue that you're identifying, which is communities lean towards security, I believe, based on what I've seen, when they're anxious about what's happening otherwise. It's to build in ways to make the process more orderly and to build in a sense that the government has some response or control over what's happening. And there are many ways to do that don't involve security per se. I think the more planning that communities can do on the front end, the more identification of resources. So you don't have situations where you have thousands and thousands and thousands. In the case of unaccompanied children, it was thousands of kids who are basically stuck at Border Patrol stations. The Border Patrol agents are changing diapers. It turns into a big public relations issue as well as just a logistical issue. The more that communities, whether it's the federal government or the state government or local government, and certainly best if they're all working together, can identify a way to respond as the migrants are coming in so that it goes into more orderly channels, I think that decreases the inclination to go for a more securitized response. My personal experience working on this issue was the difference between the first big wave of migration in 2014 versus what we saw then in, I think, 2016, was that we learned from the mistakes of 2014 and we put in place both in terms of the federal government, but also with our partners within the immigration advocacy community and the churches, et cetera. We put in place ways to quickly identify who was there, move them out, reunite them with family, put them into the immigration system, et cetera, so that there wasn't the same sort of public reaction to what was happening. I don't think anybody even realized how many or what was happening on the borders. That wasn't really in people's heads. Whereas 2014, when you had no real good plan and lots of cameras, lots of anxiety, lots of pressure from governors and mayors, do something about this. It changes the dynamic. It reduces the space to make thoughtful decisions.
I guess I would just say in closing on that, I think part of what, we are frankly seeing with this administration a great emphasis on security and sort of seeing these issues through that security lens. There's no doubt about that. But I think part of what is a very important contribution that the report is trying to make is trying to lay out some other tools to try to create space and to help communities put programs in place. Because again, as you've said, the larger source of the insecurity is the kind of destabilizing that happens. And so I think, some of this is going to be a lot of missionary work, I think, that has to happen, and not just with the executive branch, but also with folks in Congress. Some of it needs to be getting the real facts out about what is and isn't happening in terms of the threats of foreign fighters coming in as refugees and all of that. But I think part of what we're trying to do with this report is to give some additional tools on the non-security side, if you will, to try to create the opportunity, at least, for a more balanced approach to this set of issues. Mm-hmm. So thank you all so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, ladies, for a terrific discussion. We look forward to staying engaged with you all. And again, I think, we'd love to work with you in terms of trying to build there's already clearly a community of interest around this set of issues, but we'd really like to get your ideas about how to try to, again, put some of this into practice. So thank you very much. Please join me in giving a hand to our panelists.